When you've lost everything that ever mattered, when the world has forgotten your name and your worth, you learn to expect nothing from strangers. Yrla knew this truth better than most as she searched the cold Norwegian shore for anything that might keep her alive another day. She was once a wife, a mother, a woman whose table welcomed friends and whose voice sang lullabies. Now she was invisible, just another soul the world had cast aside. The longship appeared through morning fog like something from a nightmare. At its bow stood Skarde Havsbane, the most feared Viking raider in the northern seas. She had heard the stories, knew what men like him did to women like her. But when this giant warrior looked down at her broken form, something impossible happened. He spoke 4 simple words that would change everything. What could drive the most ruthless man in the Viking world to show kindness to a nameless wanderer? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver ring on Yrla's finger had once caught sunlight streaming through her kitchen window, sparkling as she kneaded bread dough with flour-dusted hands. Now it was tarnished black, a ghost of precious metal that she twisted absently as the North Sea wind cut through her threadbare cloak. She couldn't bring herself to remove it, though it marked her as someone who had once been cherished, loved, protected, someone who had belonged somewhere. That life felt like a dream now, hazy and distant as the mountains across the fjord. Her husband Bjorn had been a good man, steady as the tides, with calloused hands that knew every plank of his fishing boat and gentle eyes that crinkled when he laughed. Their children, Sven with his father's stubborn chin, little Astrid who collected shells and wove flowers into her braids, had filled their stone cottage with warmth, even when winter storms raged for weeks. The village of Haugesund had been prosperous then, built where the river met the sea. Fishermen brought in their daily catch, while farmers from inland traded grain and wool. The marketplace buzzed with friendly haggling. Children's laughter echoed from the wooden church where Father Magnus taught them letters, and wives gathered at the well to share news and gossip. Yrla had been one of them, respected for her skill with herbs and her kind heart toward those in need. She remembered the morning with perfect, terrible clarity. The mist had been heavy, muffling sound when the dragon-proud ships emerged like phantoms from the grey water. By the time the warning horn sounded, it was too late. The raiders fell upon them with axes gleaming and war cries splitting the dawn air. Yrla had been gathering eggs when the screaming started. She dropped the basket, eggs shattering on stone, and ran toward the cottage where Bjorn was repairing nets. But flames were already licking at the thatch, and through the smoke she saw her husband's body sprawled in the doorway, his fishing knife still clutched in his blood-stained hand. He had tried to protect them. He had died trying. The children were nowhere to be found. She searched through burning ruins and bodies until strong hands dragged her away from the carnage. Those who survived, precious few, told her the same thing. The little ones had been taken, sold into slavery in distant lands where their Nordic features would fetch good prices. Better that than the alternative, they said. But Yrla knew better was not the same as good. For months afterward, she wandered the coastal settlements asking for news of 2 children. A boy of 10 summers with bright blue eyes, a girl of 7, with hair like spun gold. Some listened with pity, others turned away in discomfort. Most had their own grief to tend. The raids had become more frequent, more brutal. Whole communities lived in fear of longships on the horizon. When her meager savings ran out, Yrla learned to survive on scraps and charity. Pride fell away like leaves in autumn. She slept in barns when farmers showed mercy, in caves when they didn't. Her clothes grew ragged, her body thin, her hair wild and unkempt. People stopped seeing her as a person and began treating her as a problem to be solved or avoided. The irony was not lost on her that she now feared the very raiders who had destroyed her life while depending on their victims for survival. Each time dragon ships appeared on the horizon, coastal folk fled inland, taking their food and shelter with them. Yrla would hide among the rocks, watching these same vessels that had brought death to her doorstep. She had heard the name Skarde Havsbane whispered in ale halls and marketplaces, always with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. They said he was tall as a pine tree, broad as a bull, with arms strong enough to split a man in half with a single swing of his battle-axe. His longship, the Storm Wolf, was painted black as night with a wolf's head carved on its prow. When merchants spotted those distinctive sails, they abandoned their goods and ran. The stories grew in the telling, as stories do. Skarde could fight 12 men single-handed. He had once burned an entire monastery for sport. His eyes glowed red with battle fury, and his war cry could split stone. Children were told to behave, or Skarde Havsbane would come for them in the night. But behind the fearsome reputation was a man who had earned his wealth through calculated violence. Unlike other raiders who struck randomly, Skarde chose his targets with precision. Merchant vessels heavy with silver, coastal settlements fat with grain stores, monasteries filled with gold crosses and illuminated manuscripts. His crew was disciplined, efficient, loyal. They followed him not just from fear, but from success. What the stories didn't tell, what even his own men didn't fully understand, was how the constant violence had begun to hollow him out from within. Each raid brought less satisfaction than the last. The weight of his war chest meant nothing when he returned to an empty hall. Victory felt increasingly meaningless when there was no one waiting to share it with him. Skarde wore his reputation like armor, but beneath the steel and leather was a man who had started questioning the very foundations of his existence. His private chambers in the stone fortress he called home contained more than just weapons and treasure. Hidden away from his warrior's eyes was a Thor's hammer pendant, its silver surface stained dark with old blood, not from enemies, but from his own knuckles as he clutched it during long, sleepless nights. The pendant had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that. It was supposed to be a symbol of strength, of divine favor in battle. Instead, it had become a weight around his neck, a reminder of all the lives he had taken, all the homes he had burned, all the children who would grow up fatherless because of his blade. On this particular morning, as autumn mist hung heavy over the Norwegian coast, Skarde stood at the prow of the Storm Wolf, feeling the familiar emptiness that followed each successful raid. They had taken a merchant vessel the day before, clean, efficient, profitable. No unnecessary killing, just enough violence to ensure compliance. His men were satisfied, their purses heavier, their reputation enhanced. Yet as they approached the rocky shoreline, where they often made camp to divide spoils and repair equipment, Skarde found himself studying the desolate coastline with new eyes. This was what they left behind, not just empty coffers, but empty lives, families scattered like autumn leaves, survivors reduced to scavenging among the ruins of their former existence. That's when he saw her, the woman crouched between two large boulders, so still she might have been part of the stone itself. Her clothes were little more than rags, her hair tangled by salt wind, her movements careful and desperate as she searched tidal pools for anything edible. She was thin enough that her bones showed clearly beneath weathered skin, yet she moved with a dignity that poverty couldn't quite erase. Something about her reminded him of someone he had lost long ago, someone whose memory he kept locked away in the deepest chambers of his heart. The resemblance was not physical. This woman had dark hair where his beloved had been fair, brown eyes instead of blue, but there was something in the way she held herself, the careful grace of someone who had once known better days. His crew was preparing to beach the Storm Wolf, calling out jokes and making plans for how to spend their newfound wealth. They hadn't noticed the solitary figure among the rocks. To them, she would be invisible, irrelevant, perhaps even bothersome, a problem to be ignored or removed. But Skarde couldn't look away. Here was the human cost of everything he had built. His life upon, not abstract or distant, but immediate and real. A woman reduced to searching for scraps in the places where the sea left its refuse. The morning sun broke through the clouds as they approached the shore, and Skarde made a decision that would change everything. Not a calculated choice based on profit or strategy, but something deeper, more instinctive. Something that came from the part of him that still remembered what it felt like to protect rather than destroy. When the storm wolf's keel scraped against the rocky beach and his men leaped over the sides to secure the vessel, Skarde remained. At the prow, his eyes fixed on the woman who still hadn't noticed their arrival. She was absorbed in her desperate search, turning over stones and sifting through seaweed with the focused intensity of someone for whom each found morsel might mean the difference between surviving another day or surrendering to the cold embrace of the sea. In that moment, Skarde Havsbane, scourge of the northern seas, terror of merchant vessels, the man whose very name could empty coastal villages, felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not the hot rush of battle fury or the cold satisfaction of victory, but something warmer and more dangerous. Compassion. The wooden horse was no bigger than Yrla's palm, carved with the simple skill of a father's loving hands. She had found it in the ruins of her cottage, somehow spared from the flames that consumed everything else. One of its legs was charred black, and the painted eyes had faded, but she could still see Sven's face the morning Bjorn had presented it. To him, wonder and delight transforming the boy's features as he galloped the little horse across their kitchen table. Now the toy lived in the small cloth bundle that contained everything she owned in the world: a bone needle, a piece of flint, a few copper coins earned through begging, and this last reminder of the son who had called her Mama and fallen asleep each night clutching his wooden companion. She kept it wrapped carefully in a scrap of linen that had once been part of Astrid's favorite dress. The Vikings were close enough now that she could hear their voices carrying across the water, rough laughter and the creak of rope against wood. Yrla pressed herself deeper into the shadow between the boulders, making herself as small as possible. She had learned to become invisible when danger approached, to breathe shallowly and move only when necessary, but something was wrong. Instead of the triumphant war songs that usually accompanied raiders returning from successful ventures, these voices seemed subdued, almost contemplative. And rather than immediately beaching their vessel and spreading across the shoreline to make camp, they seemed to be hovering just offshore. Curiosity had always been one of Yrla's weaknesses. Bjorn used to tease her about it, calling her his little cat, because she couldn't resist investigating every sound and shadow. That same impulse now compelled her to lift her head just enough to peer over the rocks that concealed her. The longship was magnificent and terrible, 60 feet of black oak with a carved wolf's head that seemed to snarl at the waves. The sail bore the image of a storm cloud split by lightning, and shields lined the vessel's sides like scales on some great sea serpent. 24 warriors stood at the oars or lounged against the rails, their mail shirts gleaming dully in the morning light. At the prow stood a man who could only be Skarde Havsbane himself. He was every bit as imposing as the stories claimed, easily a head taller than his tallest warrior, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His beard was black as winter night, braided with silver rings, and his arms bore the intricate tattoos that marked him as a man of noble blood. The battle-axe strapped to his back was nearly as long as Yrla was tall, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. Even from this distance, she could see they were fixed directly on her hiding place, not searching or scanning, but focused with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. He had spotted her, and now he was studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Terror should have paralyzed her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to scramble over the rocks and flee inland as fast as her weakened legs could carry her. Instead, she found herself frozen in place, caught in that predator's gaze like a deer mesmerized by torchlight. Skarde said something to his men, words too low for her to hear across the water. Whatever he commanded caused a stir among the crew. She could see them turning to look in her direction, their conversations becoming animated. Some pointed, others shook their heads, and one man, a grizzled warrior with grey streaks in his red beard, appeared to be arguing with their captain. The debate continued for several long minutes, while Yrla remained crouched among the stones, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could flee now while they were distracted, but something kept her rooted in place. Perhaps it was simple exhaustion. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, and her body was running on stubbornness alone. Or perhaps it was the strange certainty that running would be pointless. If Skarde Havsbane wanted her dead, she would die. If he wanted her captured, she would be taken. Her fate was no longer in her own hands. The longship began moving toward shore, with purpose now, its dragon prow cutting through the grey water like a blade through silk. The crew worked their oars in perfect synchronization, a deadly ballet they had performed countless times on countless shores. As they approached the rocky beach, Skarde never took his eyes off her hiding place. When the storm wolf's keel scraped against stone and sand, the warriors leaped over the sides to secure the vessel with practiced efficiency. But their captain remained at the prow, one massive hand gripping the wolf's head carving, his attention still focused entirely on the woman among the rocks. "Come out!" he called, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. It was not the harsh bellow she had expected, but something almost gentle, the tone a man might use to coax a frightened animal from its burrow. "I know you're there." Yrla's mouth was too dry to swallow. She could hear his crew muttering among themselves, their words indistinct, but their tone skeptical. They were questioning their leader's interest in what they undoubtedly saw as worthless human debris. "I'm not going to hurt you," Skarde continued, and something in his voice made her believe him, despite every rational thought in her head. "Stand up, let me see you properly." Against all wisdom, Yrla found herself slowly rising from her crouch. Her legs trembled, whether from fear, hunger, or the strain of remaining motionless for so long, she couldn't say. The wind immediately caught her hair and cloak, whipping them around her thin frame and making her feel even more exposed and vulnerable. Skarde studied her for a long moment, taking in her ragged clothes, her hollow cheeks, the way she swayed slightly on her feet. His expression was unreadable, but something shifted in those ice-blue eyes, a recognition, perhaps, or a decision being made. Then he spoke 4 words that shattered everything she thought she knew about Vikings, about raiders, about the cruel indifference of the world. "Get in my boat now." The command was spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. This was not a request or a suggestion. It was an order from a man accustomed to instant obedience. Yrla stared at him in shock, certain she had misheard. Around the longship, his crew had fallen silent, their faces mirrors of her own disbelief. In all their years of following Skarde Havsbane, they had never seen him show mercy to anyone, much less invite a beggar aboard their ship. "Captain!" The red-bearded warrior spoke up, his voice carefully respectful but concerned. "What are your intentions with this woman?" Skarde's gaze never left Yrla's face. "That's not your concern, Gunner. Prepare to depart." "But sir, she's just a—" "I said that's not your concern." The words cracked like a whip, cutting through any further protest. The crew immediately busied themselves with departure preparations, but Yrla could see the worried glances they exchanged. She remained frozen among the rocks, trying to process what was happening. This had to be some cruel jest, a cat playing with a mouse before delivering the killing blow. Vikings didn't rescue beggars. They created them. "I won't ask again," Skarde said, but his tone remained patient rather than threatening. "You can come willingly, or I can have my men fetch you, but you're coming with us either way." The certainty in his voice broke through her paralysis. On unsteady legs, Yrla began picking her way across the rocky beach toward the longship. Each step felt like walking toward her own execution, yet she couldn't bring herself to resist. Perhaps it was simple resignation. After months of barely surviving, part of her was almost relieved that the struggle might finally be over. As she drew closer to the Stormwolf, she could see the intricate carvings that decorated its hull, the careful craftsmanship that went into creating such a vessel. This was not just a tool of war, but a work of art, built by master shipwrights and maintained with obvious pride. Skarde watched her approach without moving from his position at the prow. When she reached the ship's side, he extended one massive hand toward her. His fingers were scarred from countless battles, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he helped her climb aboard. The deck beneath her feet was solid oak, worn smooth by years of use, but kept scrupulously clean. The crew continued, their preparations around her, pointedly avoiding eye contact, but radiating tension like heat from a forge. She could feel their disapproval, their confusion, their concern for their captain's inexplicable behavior. Skarde gestured toward a section of the deck near the stern, where several sea chests served as makeshift seats. "Sit," he commanded, then turned to address his crew. "Cast off, we're going home." As the Stormwolf pulled away from shore, Yrla clutched her small bundle of possessions and tried to understand what was happening to her. The wooden horse pressed against her palm, through the cloth wrapping, a tangible link to the life she had lost and the children she would never see again. Whatever Skarde Havsbane intended for her, she was now completely at his mercy, sailing toward an unknown fate with the most feared man in the northern seas. The leather journal was hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Skarde's private chambers, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from the sea's relentless moisture. Its pages contained thoughts no warrior was supposed to have, doubts that could shatter his carefully constructed reputation among the brotherhood of raiders who ruled the northern seas. "The boy couldn't have been more than 12 summers," read one entry, written in Skarde's careful hand after a raid on a coastal monastery. "His eyes reminded me of someone I once knew. When he begged for his father's life, I heard echoes of my own voice from long ago. We took their silver, but what did we leave behind? What seeds of hatred have we planted?" Another page, stained, with what might have been wine or blood. "Victory tastes like ash. The men celebrate our success, but I see only faces in the flames of burning homes. How many sons will grow up dreaming of revenge against Skarde Havsbane? How many daughters will learn to fear the sight of dragon sails?" These were dangerous thoughts for a Viking lord to harbor, treasonous questions that could undermine everything he had built. Yet night after night, Skarde found himself returning to this hidden record of his growing disillusionment, adding new entries as his doubts multiplied like storm clouds on the horizon. The journey to his stronghold took 3 days of steady sailing through increasingly remote waters. Yrla had expected to be treated as cargo at best, a prisoner at worst. Instead, she found herself occupying a place of strange honor near the stern, given a thick wool cloak to ward off the sea's chill and regular portions of the crew's own food. She watched Skarde's island home emerge from the morning mist like something from a saga told around winter fires. The settlement was built on terraced levels rising from a natural harbor, with stone buildings that spoke of wealth and permanence, rather than the temporary camps she had expected. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily tasks. Women hanging laundry, children chasing chickens, men repairing nets and tools. "Welcome to Ravensholm," Skarde said, the first words he had spoken to her directly since his initial command. He stood beside her at the rail, close enough that she could smell the leather and iron scent that clung to his clothes. "It's been my home for 15 years. The harbor was busy with activity as they approached. Fishing boats dotted the water. Like seabirds, their crews calling out greetings to the returning Stormwolf. But Yrla noticed something unusual. While the fishermen showed proper respect for their lord, there was no fear in their voices. They hailed Skarde with genuine warmth, as if he were a protective father rather than a conquering warlord. As the longship was secured to the stone pier, people gathered to welcome their returning warriors. Wives embraced husbands, children ran to fathers who swung them high in the air, and merchants prepared to examine whatever goods the raid had yielded. It was a scene of domestic happiness that seemed impossible to reconcile with the fearsome reputation of the ship's crew. Skarde helped Yrla down to the pier with the same unexpected gentleness he had shown when bringing her aboard. The crowd parted respectfully as he led her up the winding path toward the settlement's heart, but she could feel their curious eyes following her progress. A ragged stranger brought home by their lord. What could it mean? The great hall that dominated the settlement's highest terrace was built of stone and timber, its peaked roof decorated with carved dragon heads that watched over the harbor like sentinels. Inside, the space was warm and bright, lit by oil lamps and a massive central fire pit. Tapestries covered the walls, depicting scenes of battle and triumph, while long tables spoke of feast days and celebration. But for all its grandeur, the hall felt oddly empty. Skarde's high seat at the far end was magnificent, carved oak inlaid with silver and draped with wolf pelts. Yet something about the space suggested a man who dined alone more often than not. There were no children's toys scattered about, no women's touches in the decorations, none of the comfortable clutter that marked a home filled with family. "Helga!" Skarde called, and an older woman emerged from the kitchens. She was perhaps 50 summers, with iron-grey hair braided in the manner of respected housekeepers and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "This is Yrla. She'll be staying with us for a time. See that she has everything she needs." Helga studied Yrla with the frank assessment of someone accustomed to managing a large household. Her expression was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply practical. "She'll need a proper bath, clean clothes, and food that'll put some meat on those bones." "Where should I house her, my lord?" "The blue chamber," Skarde replied without hesitation. "It has the morning sun." Something flickered across Helga's features, surprise, perhaps, or concern. The blue chamber was apparently significant in some way, though Yrla couldn't guess its importance. The housekeeper simply nodded and gestured for Yrla to follow her. As they climbed the wooden stairs to the hall's upper levels, Helga maintained a professional silence that Yrla didn't dare break. The blue chamber proved to be a comfortable room, with whitewashed walls, a proper bed with clean linens, and windows that looked out over the harbor. It was luxury beyond anything Yrla had experienced in months of homelessness. "There's a bathing room through that door," Helga said, pointing to a small side chamber. "I'll have hot water brought up and clothes that should fit well enough. You look to be about the same size as—" She stopped herself abruptly, as if she had been about to say something inappropriate. The same size as whom? Yrla wondered, but she didn't voice the question. Instead, she simply nodded her gratitude, afraid that speaking might somehow break this fragile spell of kindness. When the servants arrived with steaming buckets of water, Yrla sank into the wooden tub with a sigh that came from her very soul. The hot water stung dozens of small cuts and scrapes she had forgotten she possessed, but the pain was eclipsed by the sheer bliss of being truly clean for the first time in months. The clothes Helga provided were simple but well made. A linen underdress, a woolen overdress dyed deep blue, and a cloak of soft grey wool. They fit as if they had been made for her, which raised new questions about their previous owner. When she emerged from the bathing chamber, she found a tray of food waiting on the room's small table. Fresh bread, still warm from the ovens, cheese that tasted of summer pastures, dried fish, and ale that was rich and satisfying. It was a feast compared to the scraps she had survived on, and she had to force herself to eat slowly to avoid making herself sick. As evening fell and the settlement quieted around her, Yrla sat by her window watching the lights of fishing boats bob in the harbor. She could hardly believe that this morning she had been scrounging for limpets among the rocks, expecting to die forgotten and alone. Now she was housed like an honored guest in the stronghold of the most feared warrior in The north, but why? What could Skarde Havsbane possibly want with a homeless widow? And why did she sense that her presence here had stirred memories that others would prefer to keep buried? Outside her door, she could hear the muffled sounds of the great hall. Men's voices raised in conversation, the clink of ale cups, occasional laughter, normal sounds of a household settling in for the night. Yet beneath it all, she sensed undercurrents of tension, whispered conversations about their lord's unprecedented act of mercy. Tomorrow would bring answers, perhaps. For tonight, she would simply be grateful for warmth, safety, and the first peaceful sleep she had known in far too long. The embroidered cloak lay folded in the wooden chest at the foot of Yrla's bed, its colors still vibrant despite years of storage. When she lifted it to examine the needlework, her breath caught. The embroidery was exquisite, silver threads forming intricate patterns of ravens and wolves, with tiny garnets sewn along the borders like drops of blood against winter snow. This had been made by skilled hands with love and patience, a garment fit for a lady of high station. On the chest's inner lid, carved in runic script, was a woman's name, Astrid, the same name as her lost daughter, though this Astrid was clearly someone who had lived and died long before Yrla's world collapsed. She traced the carved letters with one finger, wondering who this woman had been and why her clothes now warmed a homeless stranger. The morning sun streaming through her windows revealed Ravensholm in all its ordered prosperity. From her chamber, Yrla could see the settlement's various levels: workshops where smiths hammered iron into tools and weapons, storehouses filled with grain and preserved fish, gardens where women tended vegetables and herbs. It was a complete community, self-sufficient and thriving under Skarde's protection. What surprised her most was the laughter. Children's voices carried on the morning air as they played between the houses, their games no different from those her own children had enjoyed. Young mothers called warnings and encouragements, their tones warm with affection rather than the constant anxiety she had seen in so many coastal settlements. These people felt safe in a way that had become increasingly rare in a world plagued by raiders. A soft knock at her door interrupted her observations. "Come," she called, expecting Helga with breakfast or fresh linens. Instead, Skarde himself entered, carrying a wooden tray laden with food. He had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe, and his presence seemed to fill the modest chamber. Without his mail and weapons, dressed in simple wool tunic and trousers, he looked less like the fearsome Havsbane and more like a prosperous farmer. Yet the aura of contained power remained, evident in the way he moved with predatory grace despite his size. "I brought your morning meal," he said, setting the tray on the small table. "I thought you might have questions." Yrla gestured to the embroidered cloak she had been examining. This was hers, wasn't it? Astrid's. Something shifted in Skarde's expression. Not pain exactly, but a carefully controlled acknowledgement of old wounds. "My wife. She died 6 years ago, along with our children. Fever took them all within a week." The simple words carried such weight of grief that Yrla felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm sorry. I know what it means to lose everything." "Yes," he said, quietly. "I believe you do." They stood in silence for a moment, two people bound by the terrible arithmetic of loss. Outside, life continued its normal rhythms, but here in this chamber hung heavy with memory, they shared an understanding that needed no words. "Why did you bring me here?" Yrla asked finally. "Your men think you've gone mad." Skarde moved to the window, gazing out at his domain with eyes that seemed to see beyond the present moment. "Perhaps I have. When I saw you on that beach, searching for scraps among the stones, you reminded me of someone I failed to save once. Someone who died because I was too far away, too busy with war and conquest to protect what truly mattered." "Your wife?" "No, my sister." The words came slowly, as if pulled from some deep well of regret. "She was taken in a raid while I was off building my reputation as a great warrior. By the time I returned home, she was gone, sold into slavery or worse. I never found her." Yrla understood now. She was not just a homeless woman to him, but a chance at redemption, a way to save someone when he had failed before. The knowledge was both comforting and unsettling. She was grateful for his protection, but being the focus of another's need for absolution came with its own burden. "What happens now?" she asked. "You live," he said simply. "You eat regular meals. You sleep in a warm bed. You remember what it feels like to be safe. Beyond that, we'll see what develops." Over the following days, Yrla found herself gradually integrated into the life of Holm. Helga put her to work in the kitchens at first, testing her skills and disposition. Yrla's knowledge of herbs and healing, learned in her former life as a fisherman's wife, proved valuable in treating minor injuries and ailments. The settlement's people began to accept her presence, their initial suspicion giving way to cautious friendship. She discovered that Skarde ruled with a surprisingly light hand. Rather than the iron-fisted tyrant she had expected, he was more like a protective patriarch who ensured his people's welfare while allowing them considerable freedom. His warriors were disciplined but not brutalized, his servants were well treated, and his tenants prospered under his protection. The children of Holm seemed to adore him particularly. She often saw him in the settlement's center, listening gravely to young petitioners who brought him everything from broken toys to disputes over marbles. He would solemnly examine each problem and render judgment with the same gravity he might show in deciding matters of war and peace. Watching him interact with these children, Yrla began to understand the depth of his loss. His gestures were those of a man who had once been a father, who knew instinctively how to calm a crying infant or coax laughter from a sullen child. The absence of his own family had left him bereft, but it had also made him a protector of other people's children. One evening, as autumn deepened toward winter, Yrla found herself in the great hall after the evening meal. Most of the household had retired, leaving only a few men playing dice near the fire, and Skarde himself, seated in his great chair with a cup of ale and a distant expression. She approached slowly, uncertain of her welcome in this moment of private reflection. He looked up as she drew near, and something in his expression softened. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a bench near his chair. "The evenings grow long, and I find myself poor company for my own thoughts." She settled beside him, aware of the honor he was showing her. In the flickering firelight, with the hall's shadows wrapped around them like a cloak, the terrible gap between their stations seemed less important than their shared understanding of loss. "Tell me about your children," he said quietly. "What were they like?" It had been months since anyone had asked about Sven and little Astrid, months since she had been able to speak their names aloud. But here, in the warmth of Skarde's protection, she found the courage to remember them not as victims, but as the bright souls they had been. The runestone stood in a grove of ancient oak trees behind the settlement, its weathered surface carved with symbols that predated even the oldest memories of Holm. Yrla discovered it during one of her walks through the island's quieter paths, drawn by the sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the sacred grove. The stone was tall as a man and twice as wide, its runic inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. She couldn't read the ancient script, but something about the carvings spoke to her in a language older than words. The central image showed a warrior laying down his sword before a woman holding a child, while around the border ran symbols that seemed to tell a story of transformation. Weapons becoming tools, wolves becoming shepherds, storms giving way to calm seas. "You found the old prophecy stone," came Skarde's voice from behind her. She turned to see him approaching through the dappled sunlight, his expression thoughtful. "My grandfather's grandfather told stories about it when I was young." "What does it say?" Yrla asked, running her fingers along the worn runes. "The old tongue is mostly lost to us now, but the wise women used to say it spoke of a time when the fiercest warrior would choose mercy over conquest, when ravens would nest with doves, and the Stormbringer would become the peacekeeper." Skarde's voice carried a note of self-mockery. Saga nonsense, most likely. But the stone has stood here longer than memory. It had been 6 weeks since Yrla's arrival at Ravensholm, and the settlement had begun to feel like home in ways she hadn't expected. The children had been the first to accept her completely, perhaps sensing her maternal nature, or simply responding to the kindness she showed them. They followed her through the settlement, bringing her their small troubles and accepting her gentle guidance with the trust that came naturally to the young. She had taken particular interest in the island's orphans, children whose parents had died in raids or illness, who survived on the community's charity. There were 7 of them, ranging in age from 4 to 14, and they lived in a corner of the great hall with minimal supervision. Yrla began spending her evenings with them, telling stories, mending their clothes, and providing the maternal attention they had been lacking. "She's making them soft," she overheard one of Skarde's warriors complaining to his companions. "Viking children need to be hard, ready for battle. All this coddling will ruin them." But when Skarde learned of her work with the orphans, his response surprised everyone. "Build them a proper house," he commanded his carpenters, "with separate sleeping chambers and a kitchen, and see that Yrla has whatever supplies she needs to care for them properly." The gesture sent ripples of speculation through the settlement. Their lord's growing attachment to the mysterious woman was becoming impossible to ignore, and opinions were divided about what it meant for Ravensholm's future. More troubling to some was Skarde's changing attitude toward raiding itself. When messengers arrived from other Viking lords with news of rich merchant convoys or vulnerable coastal settlements, he listened politely but declined to participate. His own ships remained in harbor, their crews growing restless with inactivity. "The autumn raiding season is nearly over," Gunnar approached his captain one morning as Skarde supervised the construction of the orphan house. "The men are beginning to ask questions about next spring. Will we be sailing with the fleet?" Skarde hammered another nail into the timber frame before answering. "Tell me, Gunnar, how many seasons have we raided together?" 8 years, my lord, since you recruited me from Jarl Ericsson's crew. And in those 8 years, what have we gained? I'm wealthy enough to buy 3 more ships. You all have silver to spare. Our families want for nothing. What more do we need?" Gunnar frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "It's not just about wealth, Captain. It's about reputation, about maintaining our place among the brotherhood of sea kings. If we go soft, others will see us as weak. They'll challenge our territorial claims, raid our trading partners, perhaps even attack Ravensholm itself." It was a valid concern, and Skarde knew it. The Viking world operated on a delicate balance of fear and respect. A leader who showed weakness would quickly find himself besieged by ambitious rivals. Yet the thought of returning to the old ways of blood and burning filled him with a weariness that went deeper than mere battle fatigue. "Let me ask you something else," Skarde said, setting down his hammer. "When you return from a raid, covered in glory and laden with treasure, what do you feel?" "Pride, my lord, satisfaction, the knowledge that I've provided for my family and proven my worth." "And how long does that feeling last?" Gunnar was quiet for a moment, considering. "A few days, perhaps a week. Then we begin planning the next raid." "Exactly, like a man dying of thirst who drinks salt water. Each victory only increases the craving for more." "When does it end, Gunnar? When we've burned every coastal settlement from here to Constantinople? When there's no one left to raid?" The conversation was interrupted by children's laughter as the orphans came running to see the progress on their new home. Little Sig, who couldn't have been more than 5 summers, tugged at Skarde's tunic and pointed excitedly at the roof beams. "Will it have real beds, Lord Skarde, with blankets that don't have holes?" Skarde knelt to the boy's level, his expression gentle. "It will have the finest beds in all of Ravensholm, little one, and warm blankets, and a fire that never goes cold, and windows to let in the morning sun." Watching him with the children, Yrla felt something shift in her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced since losing her own family. It wasn't just gratitude for his protection or admiration for his surprising gentleness. It was something deeper, more dangerous. She was beginning to care for this complex man who had saved her life and was now reshaping his own. That evening, she found him in his private chambers, studying maps of the northern seas. He looked up as she entered, and she saw the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. "Gunnar spoke to me about the raiding season," he said without preamble. "He's worried that I'm growing weak, that my men will lose respect for me." "What do you think?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his work table. "I think he's probably right. The old ways demand constant proof of strength. A Viking, lord who doesn't raid, is like a wolf that won't hunt. Eventually, the pack finds a new leader." "But," Skarde smiled at her perceptiveness, "but I find myself caring less about the pack's opinion and more about what I see in the mirror each morning. These hands have spilled enough blood to fill a lake. These eyes have seen enough homes burn to light the sky. I'm tired of being the monster that mothers use to frighten their children." "Then change," Yrla said simply. "You have the power to choose a different path." "It's not that simple. I have responsibilities. To my people, to my warriors, to the alliances that keep Ravensholm safe. If I abandon the raiders' path entirely, others will see it as weakness and move against us." "Then find a third way," she suggested. "Viking lords have been more than just raiders before. Some built trading empires, others became great explorers or wise rulers. Perhaps it's time for Skarde Havsbane to become something new." Outside, autumn winds rattled the shutters, and Yrla could hear the distant sound of waves against the harbour walls. Change was coming whether they welcomed it or not. The only question was whether they would guide that change or be swept away by it. The war axe hung on the wall of Skarde's private chambers like a silent judge, its blade still sharp enough to split a hair, despite having tasted blood in 3 generations of battles. The weapon had belonged to his grandfather, Thorulf the Red, and before that to Thorulf's father, who had carried it in the great raids along the Frankish coast. The ash handle was worn smooth by countless hands, and runic inscriptions along the blade told the story of victories won and enemies slain. Each night, as Skarde sat at his table reviewing reports or studying his maps, he could feel the axe's presence like a weight on his soul. It represented everything he had been raised to become: a warrior in an unbroken line of warriors, a man who earned respect through strength and fear. To abandon that legacy felt like betraying not just his ancestors, but the very essence of what it meant to be Viking. Yet increasingly, the axe felt like a shackle rather than an inheritance. The confrontation came on a grey morning when the first snow dusted Ravensholm's rooftops. Thorvald Ironside arrived with 2 longships and 40 warriors, their vessels bearing the wolf banners of the eastern fjords. He was a man cut from the old mould, tall, broad-shouldered, with scars mapping his face like a chart of past victories. His reputation for ruthlessness was legendary even among Vikings, and his arrival set the entire settlement on edge. Skarde met him in the great hall with full ceremony, offering guest right and the hospitality due to a fellow lord. But beneath the ritual courtesies, tension crackled like lightning before a storm. "Skarde Havsbane," Thorvald said, raising his ale cup in salute. "The Stormbringer himself. Though I hear the storms have been strangely calm of late. My ships rest in harbour for the winter," Skarde replied carefully, "as do most wise captains when the seas grow treacherous. Wise, perhaps, but what of profitable?" Thorvald's smile was sharp as his sword. "The merchant routes still flow with silver. The coastal settlements still grow fat with harvest stores. A warrior's reputation rusts like iron when left too long in the sheath." Around the hall, Skarde's men shifted uncomfortably. They had heard such criticisms whispered in ale halls and trading posts, but none had dared voice them so directly. Now, with Thorvald's challenge hanging in the air like incense, they watched their lord's reaction with keen interest. "Some might say," Skarde replied evenly, that true strength lies in knowing when not to draw the sword. Thorvald laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Pretty words, poets' words, but I wonder what your crew thinks of such philosophy when their purses grow light and their enemies grow bold. Young Eric, barely 18 and eager to prove himself, spoke up from his place near the fire. My lord, Skarde's wisdom has brought us prosperity without bloodshed. Surely that's worth more than empty boasting. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Thorvald's face darkened, and his hand moved instinctively toward his sword hilt. Empty boasting. Boy, I've burned more ships than you've ever seen. My name opens treasure rooms and empties harbors from here to the Celtic shores. And what do you have to show for it besides scars and enemies? Eric shot back, his youth making him reckless. Our Lord protects his people without the blade. Took Eric through the heart before he could finish the sentence. Thorvald's sword moved like striking lightning, and the young warrior was dead before he hit the floor, his blood spreading across the stone in a growing pool. The hall erupted into chaos. Skarde's men reached for weapons, while Thorvald's warriors closed ranks around their leader. For a moment, violence trembled on the edge of explosion, held back only by the ancient laws of guest right that made murder in one's own hall a cursed act. You've killed one of my men under my own roof, Skarde said, his voice deadly quiet. The war axe seemed to call to him from its place on the wall, promising swift vengeance for this insult. I've killed a boy who didn't know when to hold his tongue, Thorvald replied, wiping his blade clean. Perhaps if his lord had taught him proper respect for his betters, he might still be breathing. Yrla watched from the shadows near the kitchen entrance, her heart hammering with fear and fury. Eric had been one of the orphans she had helped raise, a good-hearted boy whose only crime was loyalty to the man who had given him purpose. Now, he lay dead because of pride and posturing, another young life sacrificed to the endless cycle of Viking violence. Skarde stared down at Eric's body, and something fundamental shifted in his expression. When he looked up at Thorvald, his eyes held a cold rage that made even the hardened raiders step back. You want to test strength? Skarde asked. Very well. I challenge you to Holm gang at first light. Single combat to settle this matter properly. Thorvald grinned, showing teeth stained with wine and violence. Now you sound like the Havsbane of old. I accept. May the gods judge between us. As the two groups separated to their respective quarters for the night, Yrla found herself alone with Skarde in his chambers. He stood before the war axe, his hands clenched into fists, his entire body radiating tension. This is what I've been trying to escape, he said without turning around. This endless cycle of challenge and response, blood calling for more blood. I try to build something better, and they drag me back into the old ways. You don't have to fight him, Yrla said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't true. Yes, I do. If I back down now, every ambitious lord from here to Iceland will see it as weakness. They'll come for Ravensholm, for my people, for you. Sometimes the only way to protect peace is through war. He turned to face her, and she saw the weight of terrible decision in his eyes. I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow, these weeks with you have been the closest I've come to happiness since Astrid died. You've shown me what I could be, what I could build, but some paths once chosen can only be walked to their end. That night, as snow fell on Ravensholm and two armies camped uneasily in the same hall, Yrla lay awake listening to the wind and wondering if the man she had come to love would survive to see another dawn. Eric's death had shattered the fragile peace they had been building, and tomorrow would determine whether Skarde's transformation had been real or merely an illusion waiting to be shattered by the first test of strength. Outside her window, she could see guards patrolling the settlement's walls, their torches moving like fireflies in the darkness. Even in sleep, Ravensholm held its breath, waiting for the violence that morning would bring. The blood-stained letter was tucked beneath Thorvald's sea chest like a trophy, its parchment yellowed with age, and its words written in the casual tone of a man recounting a successful day's work. Yrla found it by accident when she was helping Helga gather the visiting warrior's washing, a simple domestic task that would change everything. The settlement at Haugesund burned well, the letter began in Thorvald's familiar hand. 3 dozen, dead including their headman who thought his fishing knife could match my sword. Good sport, though the real prize was the children. Fair-haired ones always fetch the best prices in the eastern markets. The woman with the herb garden fought like a wildcat when we took her young ones. Had to knock her senseless to stop her clawing. Left her alive, though. Seemed cruel to kill her after taking everything else. The parchment shook in Yrla's hands as she read on, each word falling like a hammer blow against her heart. The date at the letter's top matched exactly with the morning her world had ended. The description of the settlement, the headman who had been Bjorn's friend, even the mention of her own herb garden. There could be no doubt. Thorvald Ironside was the man who had destroyed her family. "Found something interesting?" came a voice from behind her, and Yrla spun to see Thorvald himself standing in the doorway of his guest chamber. His expression was amused rather than angry, as if he found her distress entertaining rather than threatening. "You," she whispered, the word barely audible through the tightness in her throat. "It was you." "Was I what, woman? Speak clearly." "Haugesund, my family, my children." The words came out in fragments, her voice breaking with each syllable. "You killed my husband. You took my babies." Thorvald's amusement deepened as understanding dawned. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, his bulk blocking her only escape route. "Haugesund, you say?" "Ah, yes. I remember now. Pleasant little raid, that one. Profitable, too. Your children brought good silver, the boy especially. He had spirit." The casual way he spoke of Sven and Astrid, as if they were cattle sold at market, ignited something primal in Yrla's chest. She launched herself at him with a fury that surprised them both, her nails raking across his face before he could react. But he was a warrior, and she was a starving woman, and the fight was over almost before it began. Thorvald caught her wrists and held her at arm's length, laughing at her futile struggles. "Such fire. I can see why Skarde keeps you, though I wonder what he'd think if he knew he was harboring the widow of one of my victims." "Let me go," Yrla snarled, trying to twist free. "Let me go, or I'll—" "You'll what? Scratch me again? Woman, I've faced berserkers and walked away whole. Do you think a fisherman's widow poses any threat to Thorvald Ironside?" But even as he mocked her, she could see calculation in his eyes. Her discovery had complicated his plans, and she represented a potential problem that needed to be solved. The guest right that protected him also protected her, but only as long as they remained under Skarde's roof. "Here's what's going to happen," Thorvald said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're going to keep your mouth shut about that letter, about Haugesund, about everything. Because if you don't, if you cause me any trouble at all, I'll make sure Skarde learns some very interesting things about his precious peacemaker." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I know exactly what happened to those children of yours." The boy lasted 3 years in the slave markets before he died of fever. The girl, sweet little thing, caught the eye of a Byzantine merchant who liked them young. She's probably still alive, if you can call what she's enduring living. The words hit Yrla like physical blows, driving her to her knees. For months, she had clung to the hope that Sven and Astrid might still be alive somewhere, might somehow find their way home. To learn their fate in such brutal detail, spoken with casual cruelty by the man responsible, shattered something deep inside her. "Stay quiet, and I'll let you keep your illusions," Thorvald continued. "Speak against me, and I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what became of your precious babies, including Skarde, who I'm sure would love to hear about his woman's tragic history." He released her wrists and stepped back, straightening his clothes as if nothing had happened. "Clean yourself up. We wouldn't want your protector to see you in such a state." After he left, Yrla remained on her knees in the guest chamber, the blood-stained letter still clutched in her shaking hands. The man who had murdered her husband, stolen her children, and destroyed her entire world was sleeping under the same roof, eating at the same table, breathing the same air, and tomorrow Skarde would face him in single combat, never knowing that he was fighting not just for his own honor, but for justice that had been 6 years in the coming. The irony was almost unbearable. She had found safety and healing in the protection of a Viking lord, had even begun to love again, only to discover that fate had delivered her family's killer directly into her new life. It felt like the gods were playing some cruel jest, testing her capacity for suffering. But as the initial shock began to fade, another emotion took its place. Not just grief or rage, but a cold determination that surprised her with its intensity. Thorvald thought he could silence her with threats and cruel revelations. He believed that knowing the truth about her children's fate would break her spirit completely. He was wrong. Yrla rose slowly to her feet, folding the letter carefully and tucking it into her dress. Evidence. Proof of what this monster had done, not just to her family, but to countless others. Tomorrow's combat was no longer just about defending Skarde's honor or protecting Ravensholm's peace. It had become about justice for all the innocents who had suffered under Thorvald's blade. She thought of Eric, lying cold in the hall below, another young life cut short by senseless violence. She thought of her own children, their bright faces, forever frozen in memory, their futures stolen by greed and cruelty. And she thought of Skarde, the complicated man who had saved her life and was now unknowingly preparing to face the architect of her greatest tragedy. The decision crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. She would not be silenced by threats or broken by revelations. She would not allow Thorvald to hide behind guest right and Viking customs while the blood of innocents stained his hands. If the Holm gang was to be about truth as well as strength, then the truth would be told. All of it. Moving with newfound purpose, Yrla left the guest chamber and made her way through the settlement's quiet corridors. She had preparations to make, people to speak with, and a reckoning to arrange. Thorvald Ironside had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed that knowing the worst would destroy her. Instead, it had given her a reason to fight. The snow continued to fall as she walked through Ravensholm's sleeping streets, but the cold no longer touched her. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that had been 6 years in the making, and she would ensure that justice was served, whatever the cost. Behind her, in the guest chamber, Thorvald's letter lay forgotten on the floor, its secrets already revealed, its power to threaten already broken. The killer had thought himself clever, but he had underestimated the strength that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything worth fighting for. The peace treaty scroll lay unfinished on Skarde's writing table, its carefully crafted words proposing a radical reimagining of Viking society. Instead of seasonal raids and constant warfare, it outlined a network of trading alliances, shared resources, and mutual protection agreements. It was the blueprint for a future where strength would be measured not in conquest, but in prosperity, where Viking lords would compete in building rather than destroying. Skarde had been working on the document for weeks, consulting with merchants, craftsmen, and even former thralls who understood the economics of peaceful coexistence. The treaty represented everything he hoped to become, not just a reformed raider, but a visionary leader who could guide his people toward a better way of life. Now, with dawn approaching and single combat looming, the unfinished scroll seemed like a monument to naive idealism. How could he propose peace to the world when violence still demanded its due under his own roof? Yrla found him in his chambers as the first grey light touched the windows, armor laid out on his bed and weapons arranged with ritual precision. He was sharpening his sword with steady, methodical strokes, the rhythmic scraping of whetstone against steel filling the quiet room. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, closing the door behind her. Skarde looked up from his blade, noting something different in her expression, a hardness that hadn't been there the night before. The Holmgang laws are clear. Single. A combat. No interference. It's between Thorvald and me now. What if I told you there was more at stake than your honor or Eric's death? Yrla moved closer, her hand reaching into her dress to withdraw the blood-stained letter. What if I told you that Thorvald Ironside is guilty of crimes that go far beyond insulting you in your own hall? She placed the letter on his table beside the peace treaty, the contrast between the documents stark. One representing hope for D, the future, the other documenting atrocities of the past. Skarde read in silence, his face growing darker with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Yrla with eyes that held both understanding and terrible anger. "Haugesund," he said quietly, "your village, your family, my husband, my children, everything I lost, everything that led me to that beach where you found me. It all traces back to this man who now sits in your hall, eating your food and mocking your mercy." Skarde stood abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see the combat ground being prepared in the settlement center. Already people were gathering despite the early hour, his own people mixing with Thorvald's warriors, all drawn by the ancient appeal of watching two strong men settle their differences with blade and blood. "This changes everything," he said. "This isn't just about defending my honor anymore. It's about justice for crimes that demand answering." "Yes," Yrla agreed. "But it's also about choosing what kind of man you want to be. You could kill him in righteous fury and be justified by any law, or you could defeat him and show mercy, proving that your transformation is real. After what he's done, after the children he's murdered, the families he's destroyed." Skarde's voice carried genuine confusion. "How can you speak of mercy for such a monster?" "Because mercy is the only thing that breaks the cycle," Yrla replied. "If you kill Thorvald, his followers will seek revenge. They'll raid our shores, attack our people, and in time someone will rise to challenge you in turn. But if you spare him, if you show that strength can be used to protect rather than destroy, perhaps others will follow that example." It was a beautiful ideal, but Skarde knew the harsh realities of Viking politics. "You're asking me to risk everything on the hope that other men will see wisdom where they've always seen weakness. I'm asking you to be the man I've watched you become these past weeks. The man who builds houses for orphans instead of burning homes. The man who listens to children's problems with the same attention he gives to matters of war. The man who saved a homeless woman not because it benefited him, but because it was right." Outside, the mourning crowd was growing larger. Word had spread beyond Ravensholm. Fishing boats from neighboring settlements had arrived during the night, their crews eager to witness the famous Holmgang. Some came seeking entertainment, others hoping to see the mighty Havsbane brought low. All would leave with stories that would spread across the northern seas. "There's something else," Yrla continued. "I've been speaking with some of the visiting warriors, men from settlements Thorvald has raided. They remember him, remember the cruelties he's inflicted. If you defeat him publicly, if you expose his crimes before witnesses, it won't just be justice for my family. It will be justice for dozens of families, hundreds of victims. And if I lose, if his blade finds my heart before mine finds his?" The question hung between them like a sword blade. Yrla had considered this possibility through the long, sleepless hours of the night. Thorvald was no aging warrior trading on past glories. He was still in his prime, still deadly, still driven by the kind of focused aggression that made Vikings feared across 3 continents. "Then at least the truth will have been spoken," she said. "At least people will know what kind of man he really is. And perhaps that knowledge will plant seeds of doubt about the old ways." Skarde turned from the window to face her fully. "You realize what you're asking of me? To fight not just for victory, but for an ideal that half the witnesses won't understand and the other half will see as weakness? I'm asking you to be the man you chose to become when you pulled me from that beach. the man who saw suffering and chose to heal rather than cause more. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of decision heavy between them. Outside, the sound of voices grew louder as more spectators arrived. The Holm gang would begin soon, whether they were ready or not. "I love you," Skarde said suddenly, the words simple and direct. "Whatever happens out there, I want you to know that. These weeks with you have been the first time in years that I've felt truly alive, truly worthy of the life I've been given." Yrla felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I love you too, which is why I have to ask this of you. Be the man I fell in love with, not the man others expect you to be." A knock at the door interrupted them. "Lord Skarde," came Gunnar's voice. "It's time." Skarde began donning his armor, mail shirt, leather braces, iron helmet with its distinctive wolf crest. Each piece was familiar, worn in dozens of battles, stained with the blood of men whose names he no longer remembered. But today, each buckle felt heavier, each strap more burdensome. "Will you watch?" he asked as he strapped on his sword belt. "I'll be there," Yrla promised. "Whatever happens, you won't face it alone." As they prepared to leave his chambers, Skarde's gaze fell once more on the peace treaty scroll. The document that represented his vision for a better future lay side by side with Thorvald's letter documenting past atrocities. Two paths diverging, two choices that would define not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone who looked to him for leadership. He picked up the treaty scroll and handed it to Yrla. "If something happens to me, give this to Gunnar. Tell him it represents my true will for Ravensholm's future." "Nothing will happen to you," she said firmly. "You're fighting for justice now, not just honor. The gods favor those who protect the innocent." They walked together through the settlement's winding paths toward the combat ground, past homes where families were gathering to witness the Holm gang. Children pressed against windows, craftsmen left their workshops, and elderly women emerged from their hearths to see what the day would bring. At the combat ground's edge, they separated. Skarde to join his warriors and prepare for battle, Yrla to find her place among the witnesses. As she watched him stride toward the circle of stones that marked the fighting area, she clutched the peace treaty to her chest and whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening. Today would determine whether mercy could triumph over vengeance, whether love could overcome hate, whether one man's transformation could inspire others to follow a better path. The entire future of Ravensholm, perhaps of the Viking world itself, hung in the balance of the coming fight. The witness stones formed a perfect circle in Ravensholm's central square, each one carved with ancient runes that spoke of justice, honor, and the gods' judgment. These weathered monuments had overseen countless trials over the centuries, disputes between neighbors, accusations of theft or adultery, challenges to leadership. But few Holmgangs had drawn such a crowd or carried such weight as the one about to unfold. More than 200 people pressed around the stone circle's perimeter, creating a living amphitheater of expectant faces. Skarde's people clustered on one side, their expressions tense with worry for their lord. Thorvald's warriors occupied the opposite arc, confident in their leader's prowess and eager to see the famous Havsbane brought low. Between them stood visitors from a dozen settlements, drawn by curiosity and the timeless appeal of witnessing legendary fighters test their skill. The Holmgang followed traditions older than memory. Both combatants entered the circle stripped to the waist, despite the morning's chill, their torsos painted with protective runes by their respective champions. Weapons were examined by neutral witnesses to ensure fairness, and the rules were recited in the ancient tongue by the eldest woman present, Magna the Wise, whose grandmother had been a priestess in the old religion. "Let the gods judge between these men," Magna intoned, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "Let truth shine forth like the morning sun, and let justice be served according to divine will." Skarde stepped into the circle first, his movement fluid despite the weight of mail and weapons. The transformation of recent weeks had not diminished his physical presence. If anything, the peace he had found seemed to have enhanced his natural grace. He moved like a man comfortable in his own skin, no longer driven by the constant need to prove his worth through violence. Thorvald entered from the opposite side, and the contrast was immediately apparent. Where Skarde radiated controlled power, Thorvald projected raw aggression. His body bore the scars of countless battles, and his eyes held the cold satisfaction of a predator approaching certain prey. He had killed men in Holmgang before, and his confidence was absolute. "Before we begin," Skarde said, his voice carrying clearly across the circle, "there are truths that must be spoken. This combat is not merely about words exchanged in my hall or the death of one young warrior." Thorvald's expression shifted from confidence to wariness. "The Holmgang is for settling the matter between us. Nothing more. The matter between us is larger than you know." Skarde gestured to Yrla, who stood among the witnesses with Thorvald's letter clutched in her hands. "This woman has proof of crimes that demand justice. Crimes against innocent families, against children, against the very laws that govern civilized men." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Yrla stepped forward, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. 6 years ago, Thorvald Ironside led a raid against the settlement of Haugesund. He murdered my husband, burned a home, and sold my children into slavery. The accusation hit the gathered crowd like a thunderclap. Selling Viking children into foreign slavery was considered one of the most heinous crimes possible, worse than murder, worse than oath-breaking. It violated every principle of kinship and community that held their society together. Thorvald's face darkened with rage. "Lies, the ravings of a mad woman seeking attention." "Then explain this," Yrla said, holding up the blood-stained letter. "Written in your own hand, boasting of the raid, describing my family's death and my children's fate. Signed with your own seal." Several neutral witnesses examined the letter, including a priest who could read the written word. Their solemn nods confirmed its authenticity, and the crowd's murmur grew to an angry buzz. Men who had come to watch a simple combat now found themselves witnessing an accusation of the most serious crimes their culture recognized. "Even if such a letter exists," Thorvald snarled, "it proves nothing. Raids happen, people die, children are taken. This is the way of our world. I am guilty of nothing but success in warfare." "You are guilty of destroying families for profit," Skarde replied, his voice carrying the authority of righteous judgment. "You are guilty of selling Nordic children to foreign masters. You are guilty of crimes against the very people you should protect." The crowd was beginning to take sides now, their voices rising in heated debate. Some of Thorvald's supporters argued that raids were part of Viking life, that the strong had always preyed upon the weak, but others, particularly those from smaller settlements that lived in constant fear of such attacks, began calling for justice. "Enough talk!" Thorvald roared, drawing his sword in one fluid motion. "If you want to fight for this woman's honor, then let's fight. But don't pretend this is about anything more than your own weakness." Skarde drew his own blade, the steel singing as it cleared the sheath. The weapon had tasted blood in 100 battles, but today it would serve a different purpose. Today it would be an instrument of justice rather than mere conquest. "I fight not for weakness," Skarde said, settling into his combat stance, "but for the strength to protect rather than destroy, for the wisdom to build rather than burn, for the courage to choose mercy over vengeance." The two warriors began to circle each other within the stone boundary, their blades catching the pale morning light. Around them, the crowd fell silent, sensing that they were about to witness something more significant than a simple duel. This was a clash between two philosophies, two ways of life, two visions of what it meant to be Viking. The witness stones seemed to lean in closer, their ancient runes glowing with significance as gods and mortals alike prepared to see justice served. The victory crown was woven from silver wire by the women of Ravensholm as the combat raged, their fingers working with swift precision to create something unprecedented in Viking tradition. Unlike the golden circlets that marked kings or the iron helms that crowned war chiefs, this simple band of braided silver represented a new kind of leadership, one that earned honor through protection rather than conquest. The battle within. The stone circle was fierce but strangely graceful, like a deadly dance performed by masters of their craft. Thorvald fought with the brutal efficiency of a man who had killed dozens in single combat, his blade seeking quick, decisive strikes that would end the fight before his opponent could mount an effective defense. But Skarde had learned something new in recent weeks. Patience. Where once he would have met aggression with greater aggression, now he fought defensively, allowing Thorvald to exhaust himself against careful parries and strategic retreats. Each of Thorvald's attacks came with increasing desperation, as he realized his opponent was not the same man who had built his reputation on overwhelming fury. "Stand and fight like a warrior," Thorvald snarled, his breathing already labored from the intensity of his assault. "Stop dancing around like a frightened maiden." Skarde said nothing, conserving his breath and energy for the moments when they would matter most. He had learned this discipline from watching Yrla survive impossible hardships, from seeing how strength could be found in endurance rather than explosion. The crowd watched in fascination as the dynamic of the fight slowly shifted. Thorvald, for all his skill and experience, was fighting the old way, seeking to dominate through sheer force and intimidation. Skarde was fighting with something new, a purpose beyond personal glory, a reason deeper than pride. When Thorvald's guard finally dropped from exhaustion, Skarde struck with surgical precision, not the killing blow that tradition demanded, but a careful thrust that opened a long cut along his opponent's sword arm. Thorvald's weapon fell from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the stones as blood flowed freely. The crowd erupted in cheers and gasps, but Skarde stepped back rather than pressing his advantage. By all rights, he should have finished. His defeated opponent, Holm traditionally ended in death, and Thorvald's crimes certainly warranted execution. Instead, Skarde lowered his own sword and spoke to the assembled witnesses. "I have proven my point through combat, as the law requires. Thorvald Ironside stands defeated, his crimes exposed before gods and men, but I will not take his life." The declaration sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. This was unprecedented, mercy shown to a defeated enemy in formal combat, particularly when guilty of such serious offenses. Thorvald struggled to his knees, clutching his wounded arm and staring at Skarde with undisguised amazement. "Why?" he gasped. "I would not spare you." "I know," Skarde replied. "That's the difference between us. I choose to break the cycle of violence rather than perpetuate it. Your crimes deserve punishment, but your death would only create more enemies, more blood feuds, more children growing up planning revenge." He turned to address the crowd directly. "Let this be remembered, that Skarde Havsbane chose mercy over vengeance, justice over execution. Let it be said that strength can be used to protect rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm." The women of Ravensholm came forward then, led by Helga, carrying the newly woven silver crown. They had understood instinctively what this moment represented, not just the defeat of one cruel raider, but the birth of a new way of thinking about leadership and power. "We crown you not as conqueror," Helga announced, her voice carrying across the hushed square, "but as protector, not as destroyer, but as builder, not as Havsbane, but as peace-bringer." The simple circlet of braided silver settled on Skarde's brow like a benediction. It caught the morning light and seemed to glow with its own inner radiance, transforming the bloodied warrior into something else entirely, a leader worthy of following not through fear, but through love. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. Skarde's own people cheered until their voices grew hoarse, But more significantly, many of the visitors from other settlements began calling out their approval as well. They had witnessed something unprecedented, a Viking lord choosing mercy over tradition, peace over war, hope over hatred. Even some of Thorvald's own warriors seemed moved by what they had seen. The old way of thinking, that strength meant only violence, that leadership required constant conquest, suddenly seemed limited, even primitive, compared to the vision Skarde represented. Thorvald was helped to his feet by neutral witnesses, his defeat absolute, but his life spared. The shame of losing in single combat would follow him for the rest of his days, but the greater shame would be the knowledge that his opponent had shown him a mercy he would never have offered in return. "You are banished from these lands," Skarde pronounced, his voice carrying the authority of divine judgment. "Take your ships and your followers and sail away. If you return, if you continue your raids against innocent settlements, you will face not just me, but all those who have chosen the path of protection over destruction." As Thorvald was led away, supported by his warriors and bearing the weight of his disgrace, the crowd began to disperse. But their conversations were animated, excited. They had witnessed the birth of something new, and the stories they would carry to other settlements would plant seeds of change throughout the Viking world. Yrla pushed through the crowd to reach Skarde, her eyes bright with tears of relief and pride. The man she had fallen in love with had not only survived his greatest test, but had emerged transformed into something greater than either of them had imagined possible. The wedding rings were carved from driftwood that had been polished smooth by years of salt water and storm, their simple beauty reflecting the journey that had brought Yrla and Skarde together. They were far from the gold bands that wealthy lords typically exchanged, but their meaning ran deeper than precious metal. Like the couple themselves, these rings had been shaped by life's tempests and emerged stronger for the trials they had endured. Spring had returned to Ravensholm with unusual warmth, as if the very seasons celebrated the changes that had transformed the island settlement. The wedding ceremony took place in the grove where the ancient runestone stood, its prophecy of redemption through mercy finally fulfilled. Flowers bloomed earlier than usual, filling the air with fragrance that seemed to bless the union of two souls who had found healing in each other's arms. The celebration blended old traditions with new meanings. Viking customs that had once honored warriors preparing for battle now celebrated a couple committed to building rather than destroying. The feast that followed drew visitors from settlements across the northern seas, not raiders seeking plunder, but traders, craftsmen, and leaders curious about the new way of life emerging under Skarde's guidance. To the peacebringer and his "Lady," called out Magnus, a young jarl from the western fjords, who had arrived with 3 ships bearing grain and furs for trade rather than weapons for war. "May their example light the way for all who seek a better path." The toast was echoed by dozens of voices, creating a chorus of hope that would have been unimaginable just months before. Where once Viking halls had rung with boasts of conquest and plans for raids, now they resonated with discussions of trade routes, agricultural innovations, and diplomatic alliances. Yrla wore Astrid's embroidered cloak for the ceremony, its silver, threads catching the dappled sunlight that filtered through the oak leaves. Skarde had offered it to her, not as a replacement for his lost wife, but as a symbol of continuity, proof that love could survive death and grief could transform into new beginnings. She had accepted it with the understanding that she was not trying to fill Astrid's place, but creating her own. The children of Ravensholm played an especially prominent role in the celebration. The 7 orphans Yrla had taken under her care served as attendants, their faces bright with joy at seeing their substitute mother find happiness. Little Sig, now healthy and confident thanks to regular meals and gentle guidance, carried the driftwood rings on a cushion made from scraps of sailcloth, his contribution to the ceremony that marked his new family's formation. As evening approached and The formal festivities gave way to quieter conversations. Skarde and Yrla walked together through the settlement they had helped transform. The orphan house stood completed, warm light spilling from its windows, where children worked on lessons or listened to stories. The workshops buzzed with activity as craftsmen fulfilled orders from distant settlements, eager to trade with the famous peacebringer rather than fear him. Most significantly, the harbour showed signs of change that would have lasting impact far beyond Ravensholm's shores. Instead of the black-hulled warships that had once dominated the anchorage, the docks now hosted vessels built for trade and exploration. The Storm Wolf itself had been modified, its fearsome dragon head replaced with a carved dove, its war painted. Hull now decorated with symbols of peace and prosperity. "Do you ever miss it?" Yrla asked, as they paused to watch the fishing boats return with the day's catch. "The old life, the certainty of strength through fear?" Skarde considered the question. Seriously, his hand finding hers as they stood together on the stone pier. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it," he admitted. "When your only responsibility is to be stronger than your enemies, decisions become straightforward. But I don't miss the emptiness that came with it, the knowledge that each victory only led to the need for another victory." Around them, the settlement was settling into its evening rhythms. Families gathered for meals, children played final games before bedtime, and couples walked together in the gentle twilight. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that would have been impossible under the old ways, when every man was a potential raider and every stranger a possible threat. News continued to arrive from across the Viking world, carried by traders and travelers who stopped at Ravensholm to see the famous transformed settlement. Some reports spoke of other lords, inspired by Skarde's example, choosing diplomacy over warfare and prosperity over plunder. Others told of traditionalists who saw such changes as weakness and threatened to restore the old ways through force. But change, once begun, proved difficult to stop. Young warriors who had grown up hearing stories of Skarde's mercy began questioning whether endless raiding truly brought honor. Merchants discovered that peaceful trade yielded more reliable profits than risky raids. Families in coastal settlements slept easier, knowing that not all dragon ships brought death and destruction. The peace treaty that Skarde had drafted was copied and carried to courts and councils across the northern seas. While not all leaders embraced its vision immediately, the document planted seeds of possibility that would grow in the minds of those ready for change. As they returned to their hall for their first night as husband and wife, Yrla and Skarde paused once more at the ancient runestone. The prophecy carved into its weathered surface had been fulfilled, but its meaning continued to evolve. What had once seemed like impossible fantasy, ravens nesting with doves, stormbringers becoming peacekeepers, had become living reality. "What comes next?" Yrla asked, leaning against her husband's strong shoulder as they gazed at the stone's mysterious runes. "We build," Skarde replied simply. "We love. We protect what we've created and help others find their own path to peace. We prove that transformation is possible, that people can choose to become better than they were." The stars emerged overhead as they walked home together. Two people who had found each other in the wreckage of their former lives and built something beautiful from the ruins. Behind them, the settlement of Ravensholm glowed with warm light and quiet contentment, a beacon of hope in a world slowly learning that strength could be gentle, that power could be used to heal, and that the greatest victories were won not through conquest, but through love. Their story would be told for generations, not as another saga of blood and battle, but as proof that even the most hardened hearts could choose mercy, that even the most broken souls could find healing, and that even the most violent age could give birth to peace.